The room was dimly lit, the kind of soft, amber light that makes every shadow feel heavier than it should. Tom Hanks sat alone by the window, his silhouette outlined against a quiet Los Angeles evening. The world outside continued with its usual noise. Distant traffic, a passing siren. But inside, everything felt still, almost too still. His hands, once steady and confident, trembled slightly as he held a cup of untouched tea. And in that faint tremor lived a story he had kept hidden for years. A truth even his closest friends never fully understood. For decades, Tom had been America's everyman. The warm voice, the steady presence, the man who made entire generations feel safe. His smile seemed unshakable, his spirit endless, his kindness unwavering. But in the weeks leading up to the moment that changed everything, there was a quietness in his eyes that the cameras never captured, a heaviness he carried alone. It began as something small, a fatigue he brushed off, a discomfort he ignored, a tightness in his breath that he blamed on long days. But as time passed, the symptoms grew harder to hide. He learned to mask the pain behind gentle humor, to disguise the fear with the same warmth that made the world love him. No one suspected anything. No one knew how much strength it took. Late one night, with the city lights flickering against the window pane, he finally allowed himself to whisper the words he had been avoiding. "I think something's wrong, and I don't know how long I can pretend otherwise." It was the first crack in the facade, the moment when the man the world adored quietly admitted the truth he had fought to hide. And yet, no one around him knew that this silent struggle would soon lead to a revelation more heartbreaking than anyone imagined. To understand the silence Tom Hanks carried into adulthood, the quiet fear he hid even as the world embraced him, we must return to the beginning, to the boy he once was. Tom grew up in a life defined not by stability, but by movement. His parents separated early, and from that moment onward, his childhood became a series of changing addresses, shifting walls, and unfamiliar faces. He would later describe it as a life lived out of cardboard boxes, a childhood where the ground beneath him never stayed still long enough to feel like home. The boy who would one day become Hollywood's most trusted storyteller learned early how fragile connection could be. Every time he began to feel settled, life uprooted him again. A new school, a new neighborhood, a new set of classmates who didn't know his name. He learned how to observe before he spoke, standing at the edge of the playground, reading people before deciding if it was safe to approach. Loneliness was not loud for him. It was quiet, steady, familiar. It followed him like a shadow. On nights when the moving boxes were still unpacked, he would sit on the floor of yet another temporary bedroom, listening to the muffled arguments of adults in the next room. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the heaviness, the exhaustion, the disappointment adults carried without meaning to show. He absorbed it all, and in that silence a seed was planted, a sense that he must learn to take care of himself, that he should never burden anyone with his fears or needs. It was the beginning of his lifelong habit, suffering quietly, smiling publicly. In school, he was the kind of child who didn't cause trouble, who didn't draw attention, who blended into the background. Teachers described him as polite, thoughtful, a little distant. He learned to make people laugh, not for attention, but to ease the tension in a room. A small joke could soften a hard moment, and for a boy who had seen too many hard moments, that little ability felt like a lifeline. But humor was also a shield. It hid the ache of constantly starting over. The turning point came in his early teens, during one of the longest stretches of instability his family faced. He lived with relatives for a period, sleeping on couches or in small rooms that never felt like his own. It was here, amid the uncertainty, that he discovered something that would change him: storytelling. Books, plays, movie scripts. He devoured them. For the first time, he found worlds that didn't disappear when you closed your eyes, characters that didn't go away when you changed addresses, stories that stayed no matter how often life shifted. It was during those years that Tom realized something quietly profound. Stories could create the stability life denied him. stories could become home. But even as storytelling saved him, the wounds of his early years shaped him in ways the world never saw. The fear of being a burden, the instinct to stay silent about his pain, the belief that he must endure alone. These roots, planted long before he ever stepped in front of a camera, would follow him into adulthood, into fame, and eventually into the health struggle he fought so carefully to hide. Because the boy who learned to stay quiet never fully forgot how. As Tom stepped into adulthood, something remarkable began to happen, almost quietly at first, as though the universe wanted to ease him into the life that awaited him. He auditioned for small roles, worked backstage in theaters, memorized lines in cramped rooms lit by a single desk lamp. And then slowly, the world began to notice. He wasn't the loudest actor in the room, nor the most flamboyant, but there was a sincerity in him that drew people in, a rare ability to make a viewer believe every word, every hesitation, every subtle shift in emotion. Casting directors saw it, audiences felt it. His rise wasn't explosive, it was steady, organic, almost poetic. Each role he took seemed to build upon the last, as though life were guiding him towards something bigger than himself. From early comedic roles to deeply emotional performances, he carried with him the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen instability and loneliness, and who could therefore portray humanity with disarming honesty. Yet behind the scenes, the pace of success was beginning to outgrow the boy who once hid in the corners of unfamiliar classrooms. Long shooting days turned into months away from family. Awards ceremonies replaced quiet evenings. Interviews demanded polished answers, even when he was exhausted or uncertain. He learned how to be charming on command, warm on demand, hopeful on cue. But every time the applause faded and he returned to an empty hotel room, he felt the old childhood silence creeping back in, the same silence that used to settle over him in houses he never stayed in long enough to call home. There were moments during his rise when the spotlight grew unbearably bright. People praised his humility, not realizing that it wasn't humility, but learned survival. The instinct to make others comfortable, even when he wasn't. He never complained. He never asked for rest. He had learned too young that expressing discomfort felt like a burden. And yet the pressure was building. Fame magnified everything. The expectations, the fears, the responsibility of being America's dad, the public's comforting constant. Producers knew he would show up early. Directors knew he would deliver his lines with precision. Journalists expected him to smile, to offer gentle words of encouragement, to be the steady, unshakable figure the world wanted him to be. But no one ever asked what he needed. There were nights on set when he would step outside alone, leaning against the back wall of a soundstage, breathing in the cool night air as though trying to steady something inside himself. He would watch the streetlights flicker across empty parking lots and wonder how much longer he could keep up the pace. "Don't show the cracks," he would whisper to himself. "Not yet." The pressure didn't break him. Not then. But it left fractures, hairline lines of exhaustion, and unspoken fear that grew deeper with time. What the world didn't know, what even he didn't yet understand, was that these cracks would one day give way to a struggle far more personal and far more frightening than any role he had ever played. Because beneath the brightest spotlight he had ever stood under, something inside him had already begun to dim. And soon, the silence he carried would no longer be something he could hide. The first signs were subtle, so subtle that even Tom himself didn't recognize them as warnings. A deeper sigh after climbing a short flight of stairs, a heaviness in his hands when holding a script, a tiredness that didn't match the hours he slept. He told himself it was age, routine, the price of decades spent giving everything to his craft. But the truth was quieter, more complicated, and far more frightening. During one particularly demanding shoot, cracks that had long been forming beneath the surface finally began to show. He would retreat to his trailer between scenes, closing the door softly behind him, and sit on the edge of the small couch, elbows on his knees, breath shallow. Some days he hid it well. Other days, no amount of practiced calm could conceal the tremor in his hands. When he eventually saw a doctor, he went alone. He didn't want to worry his family, didn't want to interrupt the rhythm of his work, didn't want anyone to think he was slipping. It was during those quiet visits in sterile rooms lit by fluorescent lights that the truth finally began to take shape. The diagnosis was not catastrophic, not at first, but it was serious. A condition that required long-term management, lifestyle changes, medication, and above all, slowing down. Slowing down, a phrase that felt heavier than any symptom. He sat in his car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing while the world moved around him in blurred shapes. A lifetime of being strong, steady, unshakable had taught him one thing. Don't let them see fear. But for the first time in years, he felt small again, like the boy who once stood in the corner of unfamiliar rooms, trying his best to disappear. As months passed, the illness began shaping his life in ways he never expected. He turned down roles he would have once accepted without hesitation. He avoided long flights. He spent more time at home, often lying awake at night, listening to the slow rhythm of his heartbeat, as though measuring how much time he had left. Publicly, he remained the Tom Hanks everyone knew. Warm, gracious, effortlessly kind. Privately, the silence grew louder. There were days when fatigue wrapped around him like a weight he couldn't lift. Days when medication steadied him only enough to get through a few hours of work. Days when he would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, afraid of the moment he would need to tell his family the truth. He hated that idea, not because he feared their reaction, but because he didn't want them to see him as fragile. He had spent a lifetime being the comforter, the dependable one, the anchor. He didn't know who he was without that role. The illness also forced him to confront the parts of his life he had avoided. The long-buried loneliness, the years of pushing through exhaustion, the quiet ache of never allowing himself to rest. One evening, during a rare moment alone, he walked out onto the porch of his home. The sky was dimming, the first stars appearing like scattered thoughts. He leaned against the railing, his breath visible in the cool air, and whispered a truth he had kept locked inside. I'm tired, and I don't know how to say it out loud. Those words hung in the darkness, fragile and trembling. It was then he realized something he had always known but never accepted. The illness was not just physical, it was also the accumulation of years spent hiding pain, decades of carrying burdens he had never spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, the symptoms intensified, the silence grew heavier, and the weight of the truth he had concealed for so long became impossible to ignore. He knew the moment was coming, the moment when he would finally have to tell his family what he had been hiding, a truth that would break their hearts, but also perhaps finally free his own. And just a few weeks before everything changed, he gathered the strength he had left and opened his mouth to speak. The final weeks of Tom Hanks's life unfolded like a long, fading sunset, slow, tender, and unbearably quiet. By then, he had grown thinner, softer in presence, his movements slower and more deliberate. His voice, once bright, warm, steady, had become a gentle murmur, like someone speaking from a place halfway between strength and surrender. He spent most days resting near the large window of his home, wrapped in a light blanket, watching the world move gently outside. Birds perched on nearby branches, leaves rustled in the California wind, and every now and then, sunlight would spill across his face, illuminating a man who had given so much of himself to the world, and was now finally quietly returning to himself. During these weeks, his family stayed close, not out of obligation, but out of love. His wife would sit beside him, reading softly, even if he drifted in and out of sleep. His children visited often, their voices carrying a mix of strength and worry as they tried to stay hopeful. They all sensed that something was approaching, something he had been holding inside for far too long. One evening, after a day of unusual exhaustion, Tom asked everyone to gather in the living room. He sat upright, though it clearly cost him effort, and looked at each of them with a gaze that was both fragile and resolute. I need to tell you something, he began, his voice trembling slightly. The room instantly grew still. He clasped his hands together, the same hands that had held scripts, comforted others, shaped characters the world would never forget. But tonight, they held something heavier, the truth he had carried in silence. For years, he said slowly, I've been pretending I was stronger than I really was. His wife reached for his hand, but he gently placed his other hand over hers, as if asking silently to let him finish. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to show weakness. His breath caught, and he lowered his gaze. I thought, if I admitted I was struggling, you'd worry, and I didn't want to be a burden. His children leaned forward, tears gathering in their eyes. You were never a burden, one of them whispered, but Tom shook his head softly. I know that now, he replied, but I didn't then. All my life, I tried to be the one who held everyone else together. I didn't understand until recently that it's okay to lean on others too. His voice cracked, not from illness, but from a lifetime of unspoken vulnerability finally rising to the surface. He took a long, steady breath and looked around the room. I want to tell you my last wish. A hush fell across the room. I want, he said, pausing as if searching for the right words. I want this family to live without the silence that I carried. Talk to each other. Don't hide your pain like I did. Don't pretend to be fine when you're not. His wife squeezed his hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. His children held each other, listening to a truth they had never expected, yet somehow always felt. Tom leaned back slightly, exhaustion settling into his features, but his eyes remained bright, clearer than they had been in months. All my life, he continued weakly, I tried to protect everyone by staying quiet, but silence doesn't protect, it isolates. A tear rolled down his cheek, and I don't want silence to be the thing I leave behind. He looked at his family one by one, as though memorizing their faces. I want you to be open, to be honest, to be human, even when it feels scary. His wife brought his hand to her cheek. We will, she whispered. I promise. A soft smile touched his lips, small, serene, grateful. That's all I wanted, he murmured. That's my wish. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time, held together by love, by grief, by the gentle courage of a man who had finally allowed himself to be seen. In the days that followed, Tom spoke less, slept more, and drifted in and out of consciousness. Yet the atmosphere in the house changed. The silence he once carried alone was replaced by quiet conversations, shared tears, soft touches, and honest words. His final wish had already begun to reshape the family he loved. And on his last evening, as the light faded from the sky, he whispered something so faint his wife had to lean close to hear it. Thank you for letting me be weak. With that, the silence that had lived in him for so long finally lifted. After Tom Hanks passed, the world seemed to pause, just for a moment, as though it were catching its breath. News outlets shared tributes, fans posted memories. Fellow actors spoke of his generosity, his gentleness, his endless empathy. But inside his home, where the air still held the faint echo of his voice, the silence felt heavier, more intimate. His family moved quietly through the house during those first days, touching the things he had touched, sitting in the spaces he once filled, his reading glasses on the nightstand, a half-finished book on the armchair, a scarf draped neatly over the back of a chair, as if waiting for him to return. Nothing dramatic, nothing staged, just the soft remains of a man who had lived with sincerity. His funeral was small, exactly as he would have wanted. A private gathering under a gentle sky. No cameras, no crowds, just family, a few close friends, and a light breeze that felt almost like his presence brushing past. As people stepped forward with their tributes, they didn't speak of his fame or awards. They spoke of the way he listened, the way he treated everyone with the same warmth, from studio executives to the newest crew members. The way he made strangers feel seen. But the greatest legacy he left was not his films, nor his accolades, nor his public persona. It was the last wish he had whispered in his final weeks. The wish for honesty, vulnerability, and connection. His family felt the truth of it more deeply than anyone. In the days after his passing, they found themselves talking the way he had urged them to. Openly, honestly, without fear of burdening one another. They shared their grief. They recalled memories they had never spoken aloud. They reached for one another with a tenderness they hadn't known they were allowed to express. And slowly, his final wish became a part of their lives. Not because it was spoken at the end, but because it had come from the purest part of him. In the broader world, fans began rewatching his films with new eyes. They saw not just characters, but pieces of the man behind them. The boy who learned to stay quiet, the actor who carried the world with a smile, the human being who battled his fears in silence. His performances felt different now, more vulnerable, more intimate, more honest. Tom Hanks had always been a storyteller, but in the end, the story he left behind was not just on the screen, it lived in the hearts he touched. And perhaps that is the question his life leaves us with. When we are gone, what remains? The roles we played for the world, or the truths we finally found the courage to speak?